Back to the channel, it's Miriam. So today we're going to be talking about how the religion of Christianity, the very notion that someone was no longer under the law because they believed that God came to earth as a human being and died for them, led to the very cruel practice of chattel slavery.
This is a Torah-based channel committed to uncovering truth, not emotion, and not what's popular. We expose the lies, challenge long-held misconceptions, correct misinterpretations, and shine a light on the cover-ups that have distorted scripture and misled generation. If you're not willing to receive truth, even when it's uncomfortable, then consider this your warning.
Realize when people believe they're no longer under the law, when they refer to the Jewish Bible as the Old Testament as opposed to the current Testament, because the Lord has said that those laws must be done forever, they pretty much absolve themselves of any kind of moral responsibility when it comes to treating other people. And not just that, in the institution of slavery, when you look at slavery and these slaves and what they were exposed to, they were taught that simply Jesus Christ was God, that he died for their sins, and that any kind of good treatment in a good life would be something exposed in the next world. And so a lot of people don't realize this notion that you should obey your master, this notion, through all, regardless of what's going on, that you should turn the other cheek. All of these are things that contradict the Old Testament. God has never told you to let someone mistreat you and for you to turn the other cheek and for them to continue to mistreat you. And so this points to the larger theme of being the victim. Because when you have a belief system that teaches you to worship a victim God that was caught and captured and abused and assaulted and then died and was killed and died, what is there to happen to its followers? Nothing less can be expected. Nothing more can be expected. And so this notion that you should be in some kind of perpetual abusive situation, which in some ways is why the church also too has had a problem with helping married women who are being abused leave. But if that is the prescription for the God, that has been the life for the God, there's not going to be much more of a life for you as a follower. And so when it came to Christians learning, Black Christians that were forced to be Christian, and this is why I always tell people it's so important that you do not know and learn God from your enemy. If someone is abusing you, abusing your children, abusing your family, you are enslaved. It's such a cruel, oppressive slavery that's not been seen in anywhere else in the world. Do you believe that person is going to tell you who God really is? Is that person going to tell you who God is so that you can pray to this God, so you can be delivered from this God? No, of course not. And so in the institution of Christianity being taught to slaves, they oftentimes were basically not allowed to read the Bible. As you guys know, slaves were not allowed to read. They were not allowed to read anything. And for the few in the community that were appointed to teach their congregation, they were given a changed Bible. They were given a slave Bible. And this happened in many parts of the world where the enslaved were. They did not want people knowing, number one, that there were people that had been enslaved brutally, like they have in Exodus, as seen with Moses and his people, and fought, and there was a God that fought for them to be freed. Okay. Also, too, they did not want to have them learn different things that the slave master had them doing was not permissible. It was not, number one, permissible to be intimate with other people. And so for those who are not aware, many slaves were forced to be intimate with a number of others to continue to breed for that slave master. And in addition to that, even relatives were forced to be with other relatives. And so the ideas of incest that are covered in Leviticus, all of these different laws, this is just how deep this goes. They did not want them knowing that God had such a standard for them. And they, because Jesus Christ died for their sins, were responsible for upkeeping those beliefs. People forced to impregnate their own mothers, people that were forced to impregnate family members to keep these people having slaves. Because people would buy slaves and they would force their slaves to keep having more slaves. Okay, and so we're going to go over first off how Christianity, specifically the New Testament, the books that are 80% written by Paul, okay, were encouraging people to be stuck. And this is the ones they really drilled, okay? They drilled obedience to masters. They drilled faithfulness and a heavenly reward for earthly suffering. That essentially, if you were suffering and going through anything, you shouldn't try to do anything about it, because that was going to be how you earned your heaven. Okay. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh. And so the slaves, they were taught to be obedient in every way. And this is what I tell people. First and foremost, the slaves, again, learned from the slave master, or they would have learned from a slave religious leader who had a Bible, who had 90% of the Jewish scriptures removed. It would have had all the laws removed. It would have had all the stories regarding Moses and freeing anything that talked about anyone getting out of an oppressive situation or an enslavement. It would have been gone. So when I tell you, these people do not have no problem changing their Bibles, changing them for this group, changing them for that group, they absolutely will. They do not want you to know the truth. They don't want you to know who God is not, which is not a human, right? Numbers 23:19, it says God is not human, nor is he mortal, which means he's not someone subject to die. As we know, God is the only being that is immortal, who has immortality. That's what makes him God. He's not coming to be here and be mortal after he already said he's not mortal, okay? And so they were not aware of what's going on. And then in addition to that, another percentage. So like, for example, 50% of the New Testament was normally removed. So whatever little bit the New Testament may have had, which as y'all know is mostly nothing, then that even would have been gone. But Colossians chapter 3, verse 22, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh. And so these people taught people, in order to earn their salvation, they must obey the slave master in everything that they do. And if you're someone that don't know, hey, I shouldn't be going around impregnating people. I should only be having sex with my spouse. I shouldn't be having sex with my sister and my aunts and my mother in order to impregnate, to make this man have more slaves. The knowledge was not there, because they ensured to make sure it isn't. And so, of course, even with knowledge, getting out of an oppressive situation is still very difficult, which that's a whole nother topic. But still, the knowledge that was used to conceal, and that's why in some places, some people would say that's why incest and family abuse, especially in the older generations, were still so rampant, because that's what people, if their grandfather, their great-grandfather were enslaved, and that's what they seen, and that's what they learned, it was a very long time. Not even just that, there's other things as well in which the slaves were being forced to do, like the beatings and the extreme hitting and extreme violence to correct something in someone that would not have been permissible over the Torah. It was like forever. It took a long time for people to learn that was not what God had for them. Because just because slaves were freed in 1865 doesn't mean people just ran out here reading and buying books. Most people didn't have the money to buy books, let alone to read and learn how to read. It took generations for people to find out and to learn what even was right. And this was not a system, again, they had prior to in Africa. There was a standard. There was a moral standard. And a lot of people that came here, they were Muslim, or they may have been Jewish descendants. So they had a standard before they came here. But in several generations, those original people, once they are dead, they've been threatened with violence to not pass down any kind of moral belief system or standard then it becomes lost. Okay. Chapter 12, verse 47. That servant which knew his Lord's will and prepared not himself shall be beaten with many stripes. Okay. And so any kind of instances in which Jesus Christ went through abuse, or anyone is documented going through abuse, and that person basically just sticking with that, they made sure for those passages to be included in the slave Bible. And so this is the thing, this is why this belief system is so problematic. Because this idea that God would tell you that it's okay for someone to be abused and nothing happens of that person, it is against Jewish scripture, okay? And so we're going to talk about this now with the Jewish verses that shows this is something that's abhorrent, and it's something that is not permissible. Okay. And so it says in Exodus 21:16, as you guys know, slavery for the most part was kidnapping. The demand of slaves exceeded what people may have had in war captives. And so when people think of slavery in the rest of the world, slavery in the rest of the world was never like how it was in the United States or in other parts of the world where the transatlantic slave trade occurred. There had never been something such as chattel slavery, in which if someone was enslaved, their children would be your slaves and their children's children would be your slaves. Most slavery consisted of either someone being a war captive, meaning that they were captive of an enemy tribe who normally would have had some kind of semi-permanent, it wouldn't have been their whole lifetime, work assignments, or sold to being in someone's household, but at some point they would grant their freedom, or someone would sell themselves into slavery, or someone else as a form of a debt, right? As we see in Joseph being sold by his brothers. Because some people talk about the Arab slave trade. The Arab slave trade still was not like the American and the slave trade throughout the transatlantic slave trade, in which that person, their whole family, everyone they know would have been enslaved. And so there comes a time when someone can earn their freedom. And not just that, these societies had conditions to how they treated their slaves. There was no conditions and no requirements in the transatlantic slave trade to how people had to treat their slaves. There was absolutely no rules. And you see that in different legal precedences in which there were court cases. There was a court case where a man tried to sue because his slave master had went with his wife. And that person had no legal basis in their society to object. And so this was not the understanding in other parts of the world. And not just that, in the Jewish scripture, when it talked about a servitude or a type of slavery, when someone, let's say, was war captive, I'll give an example of a wife or a woman. She normally then was married off. When marrying her, she was no longer a war captive. She became a wife. And so there was all kinds of conditions and opportunities which presented that these people would not always be in this state. Okay. But a lot of the slavery that took place was based off kidnapping. And so kidnapping is something that's a death penalty crime in Jewish law. But again, they don't believe they're under that because Jesus Christ died. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. Whoever kidnaps someone and either sells him or still has him when he's caught must be put to death. And so that isn't just the slave master, right? That is also to those who are arranging slavery. Those are the people that are trading slaves, selling slaves. Okay, this is a direct ban on a type of slavery that was practiced in the transatlantic slave trade, because people were kidnapped and people were forced. And I do want to tell you guys, for those who may not know, people did fight back, and that's something they don't want you to know. When you think about the point of no return, when you think about the different places where people were shackled, over 1 million people, close to 1 million people were killed. Slaves were killed fighting. People did not just go willingly. So if someone has told you that story that people didn't fight, they just went back and the men didn't do nothing about it, that is absolutely not true. Okay. Also, too, in the Torah, it talks about the treatment of someone's servant or slave. In Exodus chapter 21, 26, verse through 27. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. And so basically any kind of injury, again, when the Torah gives examples, it gives examples, right? We can't go through and talk about every single hundreds of parts on the body. But if someone has caused extreme violence, which we know was very common, which would have occurred to every single slave, that person would have been freed, long alone the people that are tearing from limb to limb and doing all kinds of just bizarre debauchery too. Okay, and there is also two other passages that talk about if someone hits a slave in the face, that slave has to be freed. And so we're not talking about just grave bodily injury, right? Or someone losing an irreplaceable part of their body that's not going to grow back. Any kind of violence results in freedom, okay? And so this is why it's so important. And of course, we know the Torah talks about throughout that how everyone should be treated like the same under the law. Exodus 22:21. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner. Okay, so if someone is from a different culture, a different tribe, a different country, which that would have been, you do not mistreat them. Okay, and we know that's something that's reiterated over and over and over again. Proverbs 3:31. Do not envy the violent or choose any of their ways. So the perpetuation of slavery, the desire to own slaves, that whole culture of wanting to be like so-and-so because they have slaves and they have a plantation, they have this, they have that, they have access to women at any given time. Already, God has told people that you are not to want to desire to be like that. God tells you who you are supposed to be. But if you believe because your God came to earth as a human and died for you, you do no longer have to be who God told you to be. Believe what God told you to believe. You are utterly lost. And that's why the Christian religion is confusion. It is spiritual confusion and it's spiritual death. And so this is why it's so important to study the Jewish scriptures, study the Torah, okay? Psalms 103, chapter 103, verse 6, the Lord works righteousness and justice for all the oppressed. The slave master wouldn't have believed that. They would have told you to be good, to accept that you're oppressed. No one's coming to fight for you. Don't pray to a God. Your God has told you you're going to get your heaven in the next life. You're going to get your heaven after you die. Okay? To accept the reality of your situation not changing. And so it isn't just them twisting the words of God. For those who believe in the Christian religion, this is what y'all God said. This is what y'all human God has said. If you believe in Apostle Paul, who wrote 80% of the New Testament, who never in his life met Jesus Christ, he imagined he was in a desert somewhere, right? The whole religion is based off what God told you not to do. People are fighting literally to do what God told you not to do, to believe what God told you not to believe. God is a just God. And this is why people today still believe in the unfair treatment of people of color. There are people out here under the table. Some people will say it straight to your face. They do not believe that you should have anything. You shouldn't be able to work. You shouldn't be able to feed and clothe and shelter your family. Literally because of the color of your skin, nothing else. And they believe they justified in faith. So if you guys have stayed this long, make sure to like the video. I will talk to you guys in another one. Shalom.